Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into the cinematic world of Killers of the Flower Moon. This film has captured the attention of audiences worldwide, and there's so much to unpack. From its gripping storyline to the intricate details often missed on the first watch. I'll be providing a comprehensive explanation to ensure you grasp every nuance. So, grab your popcorn, and let's unravel the mysteries of Killers of the Flower Moon together. Martin Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon has finally arrived in theaters, and there's a lot to break down in the legendary filmmaker's latest film. Whether it's the shocking plot against the Osage by William Hale, the unraveling of how that took place, the investigations of the FBI which lead to quite a weak form of justice, or the ending scene and epilogue. So I'm going to be breaking down the plot and explaining the ending for Killers of the Flower Moon to help guys put together a much greater picture of the overall story. This analysis will contain spoilers, so if you do happen to be someone who hasn't seen the film yet, then I would recommend watching this upload after you've seen it. Before I get into it though, if you want to keep up to date on any of my upcoming content for Martin Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon, then don't forget to support this video by giving it a like rating, subscribing to the channel and turning on your notifications. But without further ado, let's dive into Martin Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon Explained. With Killers of the Flower Moon, director Martin Scorsese now has another classic film on his extended filmography. We've seen gripping crime stories and real events be translated to screen expectantly by the filmmaker in the past, but Killers of the Flower Moon combines both of these approaches to give us an Oscar-caliber project. His new picture, which is based on the non-fiction novel of the same name by David Gran, dives headfirst into one of the most shocking real-life stories of racial hatred, corruption, and brutality in U.S. history, detailing the murders of the Osage Nation in Oklahoma. Like the film eventually depicts, the story has often been kept away from historical records, again touching on the horrible corruption at play. And it truly explores who is to blame for all of it. While we learn a lot of the facts surrounding what happened throughout the course of the 3-hour, 30-minute runtime, the ending really does a good job of shining a light on those responsible for the Osage murders and the devastating implications for those involved. And before we get to that particular ending, we have to run round some of the shocking plot points included and what happened in the build-up to it. So Killers of the Flower Moon, unlike the source material, centers on Leonardo DiCaprio's Ernest Burkhart and Lily Gladstone's Molly Kyle, detailing an initial blossoming relationship that hides in the shadow of Robert De Niro's William Hale. We begin the movie with DiCaprio's Ernest, a former serviceman who returns from duty to live with his uncle, William King Hale, and brother Brian in Osage County, Oklahoma. Hale gives his nephew a place to stay at, and we learn quite quickly that Ernest doesn't have many skills of his own, with it metaphorically clear that he no guts, showcasing that DiCaprio's character is both physically and mentally someone who Hale can manipulate and control to get what he wants. In fact, Hale considers himself the king of the Osage and has established himself as a well-trusted and loved white man in the Osage community. It's learnt at the beginning that there is and established racial hatred towards the native people within the U.S., and that the Osage Nation have a lot of wealth because of their control of oil production on their land. But while their people are guaranteed the profits for it, they aren't given the control, with many of them having to have guardians that receive their own funds. These so-called guardians were white businessmen, and as we soon learn in the film, they used positions or often marriages to legally steal the Osage land and royalties. Ernest is another person that Hale wishes to get close to the Osage to force through this process of stealing, and we quickly learn how he plans to do so. Ernest initially makes his money by working as a local driver, and that introduces him to Lily Gladstone's respectable Osage woman Molly Kyle. Essentially, much of the Osage have mysteriously died without any investigation, and if Ernest gets close to and marries Molly, when her family dies, Ernest would inherit the bloodline's wealth. If Ernest were then to die himself, his next of kin, William Hale, would then get that money. However, while Ernest does love his money, he also genuinely falls in love with Molly after meeting her. So the twisted thing about the whole situation is that he still agrees to be involved in the violence against Molly's family while loving her, and that is due to a mix of his own greed and his uncle's manipulation. Eventually, Molly and Ernest do get married and have 3 children. And this can only mean bad things for Molly's family. On top of the escalation with the murders of the Osage, Molly herself deals with increasing symptoms of diabetes, meaning that a lot of the time while this betrayal unfolds, she is ill in bed while her husband supposedly looks after her. She receives insulin medication by the white doctors known as the Schoen brothers, which is supposedly meant to help her symptoms, but she becomes suspicious that anyone from outside her Osage community could be secretly working against her. And this is especially true when you combine this with the fact that members in her family are brutally being killed off. Those mentioned murders manipulated by Hale also involve him attempting to set up his conspirators to take the fall for them. Instead of creating a sense of mystery around all of it, Martin Scorsese makes the audience understand exactly what is happening from the outset, so there's no hiding who the real culprits are or their motivations. Scorsese aims to expose them and the systems that allowed this brutality to thrive in America. On top of this, the typical depiction of the Osage in Hollywood is one that is usually more savage, and Scorsese's film treats that with more authenticity, getting to the heart of how this was a community that were taken advantage of. Hale's victims were members of a community whose lives were stolen in the aim to steal their money. There were 60 Osage people murdered in the events, and the film focuses on the murders of Henry Roan, Anna Brown, Rita and her white husband Bill Smith, and Lizzie Q, who were all connected or close to Molly. And again, this is just a small amount of the lives taken under William Hale's twisted plot. He and his conspirators managed to get away with these murders for the lengthy time that they did because in Osage County, there was no overseeing federal government in place, and it eventually took the Osage Nation themselves to try and get a layer of support. Before that happens, though, it's really through the suspicions of Molly and her family that we see a turn in the events. While Molly gets increasingly worried about her safety as her family begins to be killed off, Molly's sister Anna has an argument with Ernest's brother Brian, and soon after, she's brought into the woods and executed. After Molly's mother, Lizzie Q, also passes away, it's revealed that the control of the oil money will now pass on to Molly and her children. Molly's other sister, Rita, and her white husband, Bill Smith, are murdered in a bombing by William Hale's man, Blackie Thompson. And this makes Molly and others decide to try and get help from outside the county. Molly uses what little strength she has left to travel with the Osage Nation leaders to Washington to plead with President Calvin Coolidge for an investigation into the unsolved murders. Although the president seems initially hesitant to go ahead with an actual investigation, it does eventually work. But before that help comes, there's a further issue going on behind Molly back, and it revolves around her own husband. Ernest has become blind to his uncle's manipulations and goes ahead with everything he's asked to do. He begins to poison Molly with the insulin injections, ones that were originally given to her by the Schoen brothers, the white doctors that she didn't trust. Ernest continues with the doctor's orders to mix the insulin with poison to slow her down. So at this point in the story, it seems that there is no way out for Molly. She becoming sicker, with her own husband administering the poison shots, and her family has been almost entirely murdered at the hands of William Hale without her knowing so. But when her and other Osage leaders went to Washington, their cry for help was eventually listened to. Agents from the Bureau of Investigation, which would later become the FBI, led by Jesse Plemons' Tom White, come to the county to begin looking into the murders on behalf of J. Edgar Hoover. Even with the FBI now on site, Hale still believed he was untouchable because of those who falsely respected him in the Osage community. But the Bureau was able to put together the truth after aiming in on a few individuals. One of those was Ernest, who is questioned for his role in the murders. After putting the last of the poison dose meant for Molly into his own drink, he is later arrested with his uncle turning himself in, so that he'd appear innocent. His attorney Hamilton, played by Brendan Fraser, attempts to get Ernest to cover up his uncle's role in the killings. And while Ernest initially goes along with it and doesn't help the FBI, after their youngest child dies of a long illness, he eventually decides to spill most of the truth in court and go against his uncle. He shares details about his role in the murders and how he lied to his wife, admitting that he was working under his uncle's orders, but that he married Molly because he loved her. He then meets with Molly after the trial, and while he admitted many truths, he still couldn't admit that he was poisoning her. Molly cannot forgive what happened to her family, and she definitely cannot forgive that the person closest to her heart could poison her, and then not admit that after all he did admit. She does not allow her relationship with him to define the rest of her life, or forget what happened. And the tragic thing about this story is that while she could not forget, history chose not to preserve and interrogate this story. Scorsese's film at least challenges the audience to watch this history, understand it, and know that what happened to the Osage Nation and Molly's family was complete and utter betrayal. Killers of the Flower Moon epilogue scene. And this mainly takes form through the unique epilogue that the film presents us with. The ending to certain characters is not revealed through a set of events with the actors, or through information or titles on screen, but rather through an episode of the J. Edgar Hoover-endorsed radio drama in the 1950s, recorded with performers on a theater stage. On top of this approach, the epilogue is ended by director Martin Scorsese himself, with a cameo as the show host that describes the end of Molly's life, and the tragedy that the Osage were left with. We learn many details about the later life of characters throughout the entirety of the show. The Shun doctors were not convicted as there was not enough evidence. William Hale was sentenced to life in prison, but was later released and lived until he was 87. Kelsey Morrison was charged with the murder of Anna. Ernest was sentenced to life in prison, but later released by a governor, and died in the 80s after living with his brother Brian in a trailer park. Molly divorced him, married John William Cobb Jr., and died of diabetes in 1937, but her children inherited her estate. As Scorsese narrates himself in the final moments, she was buried at the same cemetery as her family members, but her obituary made no mention of Ernest or the murders. The U.S. government began to manage the trust lands and pay the Osage with head rights, but there was a class action suit against the interior in the 90s, and the tribe had to file a lawsuit again by the year 2000. They claimed that management of the trust assets had resulted in losses to their funds and interest income. Eventually, the government did settle with the Osage in 2011, becoming the largest trust settlement with a tribe in U.S. history for $380 million. In the film's closing shot, we jump forward in time to an overhead shot of the Osage tribe, dancing and enduring. While the historical narrative was erased, this final shot is to celebrate their continued resistance in the face of racism. But that was my video explaining the plot and ending for Martin Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon. I'm going to be posting my review in the next few days. But overall, I thought the film was a masterful outing by Scorsese that left me feeling devastated by the end. It's not a film I'd want to revisit soon because of the horrible things that took place. But the effective nature of its telling leaves me thinking about it a lot. There's going to be plenty to discussion about it in the coming weeks, surrounding the questions raised by the ending, the movie's overall quality, the adaptation of the source material, and the narrative's central messages. But I do hope this breakdown did help some of you guys understand the events a bit better, and overall, I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the film. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into Killers of the Flower Moon. The film not only offers a gripping storyline but sheds light on a significant chapter in American history. If you enjoyed this explanation and found it insightful, please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more movie breakdowns. And as always, let me know in the comments what other films you'd like me to explore next. Until then, keep watching and keep discovering.